Okay, I think we've got that first flush of people into the room, which is fantastic. My name's Paul Lowe. I'm going to be moderating today's session with Seamus and Eliza. It's really interesting, I think, to examine this relationship between an author, a writer, and a photographer. And I think Seamus's work has a very strong underpinning, I think, of, you might almost call literary. A lot of his books are kind of very novelistic, I think, and very sort of full of all sorts of metaphors and impressions and symbols. So I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion between the two of them about how words and images interact with each other, and how you can create pictures with words and how words can add to pictures, I think. So I think without further ado, I'm going to hand over to them. As with these other sessions with the Seven Insider, if you want to ask any questions, put them into the Q&A box and I will field them towards the end of the session, or if they're relevant during the session, to Seamus or Eliza. And as always, we'll try to keep to around an hour in total. So handing over to you, to Seamus and Eliza. Really looking forward to the session. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, Eliza. Great to have you here.
Oh, dear Seamus, it's so good to see you. And I'm actually so looking forward. This is like the one Zoom that I'm excited to do. It's really a privilege to look at this work with you and remember how some of this came to be.
Yeah, well, we did a lot of traveling. I mean, I'm looking back on some of the work we did together. It's extraordinary what we covered. We both love to travel. We both are very interested in other cultures, great respect for other places. And, we met in Iraq on the way into Iraq, 2003, the Second Gulf War, crazy time. But we sort of realized that we had a lot in common. And we ended up doing trips to Kyrgyzstan, Kenya, Somalia, Nigeria, and Afghanistan. I'm going to concentrate on two. If we have time, we can do some of the other ones as well. But Nigeria and Afghanistan, to me, are the two that we had enough time to sort of get into it and understand what was going on. You'd been to Nigeria, I think, before I got there. You'd been at least one trip before and possibly more afterwards. And you were working on this amazing book, The 10th Parallel, which I joined on an assignment for The Atlantic, which is often the way one does these things. You pick up assignments, you work away on a little bit of your larger project, and meanwhile you find stories within that work space. And so we met in Nigeria, and you'd been there before.
That's right. And a little context for this particular image. If I recall correctly, I think so the story that we were looking at is what happens on the ground when sort of an anti-clash of civilizations narrative, right? This is in the early 2000s, and there was lots of talk about Christianity and Islam bumping up against one another, and what happened when that happened in communities. And so I was traveling along the edge of the Muslim world, which actually has a geographic locus at the bottom edge in Africa, at the bottom edge of the Sahel, where the desert and the highlands become jungle, because of tsetse flies, is as far as the Muslim traders and missionaries got, as far south before the tsetse flies killed off the camels and horses they were riding southwest. So this became the southern edge of the Muslim world. And then quite intentionally, which was sort of shocking to me in doing the research, in the 1800s, Christian missionaries, obviously, in Nigeria, aligned with the imperial powers of Britain, came in and deliberately evangelized, deliberately made Christians along this line, even calling it the 10th parallel. For example, Sudan was divided between North and South on this line for centuries, right? For more than a century, since 1904. So it does delineate the space between Christians and Muslims. And what we were doing here, so in broad strokes, these conflicts that look religious on the surface of them are driven by climate change, because what is happening is that the Muslim nomads of the South are pushing into settled Christian land, right? The Muslim nomads of the North are pushing south, right? So the desertification means that their herds can no longer survive on that northern land. and they're pushing into what is Christian settled land. And those almost tribal identities are coming into conflict over things like water, land, even electricity. And here we are watching, we are in that middle belt, watching these two communities bump up against one another.
How did you come across the story? I mean, the phenomenon. It was not a widely held belief. I mean, I remember meeting a guy who was a professor, and it was like you were meeting Jesus because you found a fellow believer. It was extraordinary. You were so excited.
He was exactly, Dr. Amin Al-Amin. So I came across this story actually as a result of, and we'll look at that work, but working in Pakistan and Afghanistan and Iraq, where I was seeing, going into for the editors that I worked for secular magazines, there was this attitude that religion didn't matter, that it all boiled down to political and social economy. This was a fight between haves and have-nots, right? And I knew that religion was missing from the conversation, but I also knew that it was way more complex than, 11 dudes flying planes from into the towers, right? Like it was complicated. So I wanted to go to the poorest southern edge of the Muslim world because there isn't one Islam. There were many Islams, which now I think we know, but we didn't know then. And also look at what had been left out of the story, which is in many of these communities, Christians are as armed and ready to scrap, and they see the Bible as a weapon, and that's not a metaphor. And I wanted to look at how that happens. So that was the idea: travel along this place which is a very fraught place already by nature of migration and climate and geography, and see what happens when two groups of people try to coexist, sometimes peacefully and sometimes not.
And would you say you were inspired, if that's the right word, by 9/11? Was that an impetus? Was that something that maybe there was a huge appetite for understanding the Muslim world and what was going on beyond America?
Well, yes, and I think, Seamus, this is where you and I find common ground in one of the many ways we do. I grew up in a Groover Christian household, right? My dad was a priest when I was little. He became a bishop and then a presiding bishop, and you are one of his favorite people on earth, right? And sitting around the butcher block table with like stinky monks and like lesbian priests and like talking about what God meant, like, was very common in my early experience. And so I think when we saw these religious identities become so prevalent in our culture and there was so much trying to explain them away, I knew that it was kind of a both and situation. Like, yeah, of course it's about resources, of course it's about climate and money and geopolitics and colonial history, but it's also religion plays a role here. And I think that kind of doubleness of looking, what I love doing with you is you and I are not interested in being the story, right? We are interested in, as much as we can, quietly looking out at the world as it is, and trying to hold those complexities without explaining them away.
Well, appreciating too, right? I mean, absolutely appreciating them and glorying in the difference, if you like, and accepting it and yeah, trying to sort of share it. That's
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly, and capturing it as outsiders without the need to create some false sense of insider. It's not about our identity. It's not about us. It's about trying to erase ourselves as much as possible. And of course, it's through our subjectivity. We're looking through the lens of who we are. But, the quietness of being with you in these places, and watching you work, in very practical ways, but also like artistic ways, has taught me a lot. So here we can see, this is a community where Christianity, like, it was insane. Like in the town of Jos, which is one of the places in the Middle Belt where things kick up between Christians and Muslims explicitly, the neighborhoods had adopted globalized names to identify themselves as Christian and Muslim. So one of the like Muslim neighborhoods calls itself Afghanistan, and one of the Christian neighborhoods calls itself television. So we are looking at that reality on the ground here of, you know, how those two things coexist.
It's such a big place. Everything is so muscular and larger than life. Nigeria, extraordinary. I mean, it was a very interesting place to photograph, because normally you're trying to be sort of quiet and, as you say, you know, slightly surreptitious sometimes is better that way. And but you couldn't get away with it here. I mean, you know, as soon as you walked down the street, you had a camera. There was usually a money thing involved, but it was a bit of a game too. It wasn't always very serious. I loved it. I mean, I thought it was an extraordinary place to visit. And
well, then we need to go back.
privileged.
I mean, I love working in Nigeria because Nigerians, this is the other thing about this 10th parallel space, people had much more sophisticated understandings of what it meant to live as a Christian or a Muslim, or to coexist than like Americans did, right? So there was humor, there was darkness, there was an understanding of what we're seeing now. Like I remember one Muslim telling me, listen, man, democracy is a numbers game. Like I have 4 wives, I have 16 children. So when it comes time to vote, you think I don't have an advantage over the Christian down the street who has 1 wife and 4 kids? Of course I do. And so humbling in that way, complex with how the vast amount of corruption due to oil, which is like oil is in the South. Like what we did is look at what nobody was looking at. And I think also, as I'm sure we'll see in some of these pictures, we ran up against the early development of really hardcore Al-Qaeda linked, mostly because they love Al-Qaeda, not because there's so many practical links, but between the group Boko Haram, that came directly out of this thing called Imagery education. So we are, you know, versant now in what is a madrasa. Okay, a madrasa is a religious school. Often, you know, the ideology lends itself to violence, but not always in the end. And Nigeria and West Africa has its own variant. They're called Al-Majri schools. And what's happening as a result of climate is that these schools, which used to have pretty good educations, they were mostly on farms. And so the Islamic teacher would say, come for free. You are going to farm in the morning, and then we're going to teach classes. And the kids would come from hundreds of miles away. What's happening is, since those farms are no longer viable, the teachers are moving to slums. And the way that the students make money for the teachers is to go out and beg. And then these students become a ready army when there is any scrap or politician who wants to pay for a mob for violence. And that's what we're really seeing when we see Boko Haram, which explicitly means Western education forbidden. So these are Al-Majri kids, these are itinerant students who no longer can really go to school in many cases. And I don't think, and you know, I don't think we understood that widely at that point. And it's a really important thread to understand what's happening in West Africa and the dissolution of basically nation states.
Right. We're just looking here at Lagos. What is the population? 20 million, is it? It's
Goodness, at this point with that mega city, I wouldn't even, you know, facts are not always my strong suit, Seamus. I mean, what did you love most about it? Was it humor? Was it the directness of the people? What did you love?
It was the vivacity. It was incredibly dynamic, and you know, it was, you know, what they say about New York, it never sleeps, and you know, you walk down the street and it's like bathing in soda water or something. That's what it was like in Nigeria. It was, you know, even if you're in the countryside, there was always something going on, and I loved that. I found the same in Afghanistan, but this was sort of to the max. And it was, you know, and also it was, as a photographer, you know, you do want to get pictures, you do want to capture things, and you don't want to get caught doing that, because not because you're breaking a law or whatever, but it's going to ruin the moment if there's a crowd and they want money and they're posing and all the rest of it. So there's that great game goes on, and they've got a great sense of humor. The Nigerians, I found very funny, you know.
Very funny.
But as you're saying as well about, you know, they had their complex and sophisticated societies, you know, for thousands of years, and we've got so much to learn from them. They know probably how far to bring humor. You know, yes, you know, violence erupts, but, you know, look at the population and look at how they're living and how they're putting. I mean, if that was us, you know, there'd be far more violence, I'm sure, in the same kind of circumstances and situations.
1,000%. So maybe speaking about violence for a minute, maybe this is a good moment to pause and say, you know, one of the things, okay, so Seamus and I love working in these liminal, weird spaces where nobody else is. And in this case, this got us into hot water as is part of the job sometimes. We were in a place called Maiduguri, which is in the northeast corner of Nigeria. It is absolutely riven by climate. It's a desert, right? This used to be, for thousands of years, this was like a Islamic capital of the world, and now it is a wasteland. And it's some of those, we were talking about those schools, Almajri kids, like they have begging bowls. They sleep with their heads on the begging bowls. It's complicated. And one Friday we were in a market, and Fridays, you know, one wants to be careful working on Fridays because it's a day people gather in the Muslim world and go to prayer, and then don't have to hustle off to work. And we were in a market, and we were changing some money, and a group of what we came to understand were certainly influenced by Boko Haram, it's impossible to know exactly who they were, attacked us. And we really nearly bit it, you know.
Very, very, very close. Yeah.
Tell me, Seamus, what do you remember about that? And then I'll read the poem.
Sure.
Yeah.
And if I look, I can find this picture, but it might be a little bit clumsy. Can I just stop sharing, and I'll find that picture, because it might be the thing to do. Maybe I can't do it. So.
I'll try to think what else one might need to set the scene. So imagine, I mean,
these are the kids you're talking about.
Yeah, that's enough. I mean, it's a moonscape. Maiduguri is a moonscape.
These are the schools.
Yep.
These are the kids.
Yeah. Okay. Will you share with us when you're ready?
Oh, sorry, I thought I was. Sorry, I'm useless at this.
I love that you're useless at this. It's just suspect.
Okay.
Yeah, here we go.
Okay, so these are the kids, and obviously the older kids who are probably not a great influence. This is the
Seamus, can you do that full screen thing again? Because we've got all the like.
Oh, right, sorry. Okay.
Okay.
That it?
Yeah, here we go.
Okay.
So as we said, what happens is the kids now, as opposed to working on farms, they beg, and then they bring back to their teacher, their malam, their Islamic teacher, whatever they are able to catch for the day. Okay, so I'm going to reach for this poem. Where is the book? Here we go. Okay, so this is from a book called If Men Then, which has a picture of Seamus's on the cover from Afghanistan.
And just to let you know, Eliza, this is the picture that I took that caused all the trouble. It's always the photographer in these writer-photographer relationships, because the camera is so obvious, and also it's evidence that people understand can be transmitted very quickly, and you know, it's sort of, the camera never lies, this rubbish. And we went into this place to change money, as you say. The driver never told us it was a place that you really shouldn't be, and you should certainly not be taking photographs. I found what was happening in front of me very interesting. It was you know, I was doing this all the time. we were traveling quite a lot. It's a big country. So I was photographing a lot through the front windscreen and through the side of the side window. And this was just another instance of this kaleidoscopic, fractured thing. But you can see the guy with his beads. He's pointing and saying, "What's this guy? Who's this guy? Stop that!" And then that's where life sort of came to a standstill.
Okay. Friday afternoon with Boko Haram. We spent the Hezbollah war in Nigeria, eating hummus in a Syrian cafe and watching rockets. Nights alone in a hotel in Kano, we saw a girl grow famous on TV. We almost died in the north, but you don't. No one does, except the photographer who crouched shotgun and begged the mob with hammered swords for his camera and passport. Its folio of spent pages, like the ordered laws of nations, was as irrelevant as our heads would be once cleaved from our bleeding bodies. We'd be flung between them until one boy got bored and tossed us into the sopping dirt. The young blonde hosts a special now on what to do in Dubai, that obscene indoor ski slope, jeeps that bounce like jelly donuts over dunes lit to look friendly. There must be so many of us, spies who are really academics, checking into obscure hotels, ordering contraband beer. Hating ourselves, we pick at what swells till the larvae embedded in our skin, our backs, hatch out of the skin, till moths escape, subcutaneous angels.
Amazing.
And I think, part of what's happening there is the complexity of, if we had, we are not the kind who talk about near death. That's not our jam, right? But if we had died here, like the sort of cult of heroicism about war correspondence is not our deal, and no one would have known or cared. And I think that for me was like a profound leveling. Like our whiteness just did not fucking matter. Like in the ways that there are many places that foreignness has been a form of protection over decades. Here, it wasn't. It made us a target, and the camera made us a target, but we only got out because this remarkable thing happened, which was one of the elders, like in the market, a Muslim man, got in the car with a Christian man. And basically, because our driver ran away, he left the keys, thank God, but he ran away. Understandably, he was likely to be killed. Our translator, who was out of the car, was pleading for his life. And they let him go. These two men got into the car. It was like a clown car. It was a tiny little car, and got us out of there. But like the recovery from that was uneven because it was hard to walk away from that and even understand what had happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And not that long after that, I think you went back home, and I was we both went to Lagos, but I stayed on a few extra days, and I was photographing some inhabitants under a sort of motorway. It was a Sunday, so the motorway was completely quiet. And I was photographing this scene, and somebody took offense at this, and I didn't understand what was going on, or they saw an opportunity. There's a guy with a camera, let's try and rob him. But while I was there walking, strolling back to the car, they were climbing up the supports of the motorway, and they were running towards me. And because of what happened, I think in Maiduguri, I was so kind of match fit. I did this ridiculous thing where I ran by I had a taxi driver waiting, threw the camera in the window at him, said to the guy, drive. And as he drove, I sort of ran around him and jumped into the fleeing vehicle. It's something I could never have done before or after. It was just because of this thing. My life was saved again by this. Extraordinary, these things. But do you remember that scene in Maiduguri where the poor interpreter, who, as you say, was begging for his life, they were trying to hit him with a cutlass?
Literally. What they call machetes there is cutlasses, is swords, and they were rocking the car to flip it. What had happened is somebody got their little hand through the window and was trying to get your passport, right?
And my camera, yeah.
And your camera. And they were rocking the car, and it was the, you know, it was an experience where you could feel the violence and the bloodlust ebb and flow. And it was just, it was so strange. It was like everything slowed down. And if anyone could intervene, there was like an ambivalence about killing us. It was like, oh yes, let's do it. Let's walk away. Oh no, we're gonna do it. And it was surreal in so many ways. And yeah, I mean, obviously now, you know, given what we know about the dissolution in West Africa and the rise of militancy there, there's a lot that was going on that wasn't immediately apparent to us. But yeah, it was quite intense.
And at one stage, you know, it's funny, before this thing happened, I was complaining to the driver that every time I would get out of the car to take a picture, and that was happening a lot, I would see something, I'd jump out of the car, take a picture, and jump in again. Every time I did that, to get back into the car, the guy had to open he had to use the door handle to open it up. I couldn't open it up from the outside. And I was saying, you know, it's so annoying, it's so annoying. That saved our lives as well, because if they could have opened the door, then they would have had us. And they couldn't get in. And as you say, through the crack in the window, at one stage I had my feet up against the window trying to hold the camera. It was a new camera, my first Canon 5D. I didn't want to let it go. But do you remember too that you know, the keys were in the ignition, and I kept thinking, if this goes much further, I'm going to have to jump into the driver's seat and drive. And if I do that, you know, maybe I'm going to knock someone down. But you know, I don't know what's going to happen. This is crazy. And anyway, it didn't come to that. But when we did manage to get away, as you say, slowly, somebody got into the car, we very slowly drove away. There's more discussions, even when it looked like, you know, it's okay to leave. The guy was slow because you don't want to do something too jerky. We got about a mile down the road when it was safe to stop, and they put a cutlass into the tire. So had I got into the car and turned it on, I'm sure I would have tried to take off really quickly, and the tire would have you know, destroyed itself, and they would have been on us.
Absolutely. And the other thing that I want to point out here, Seamus, is that you never, ever, ever stop working. If your eyes are open, you're shooting.
Well, that may not be a good thing.
Well, I'll tell you, and I'm going to not use names, but I was working with another photographer, not a Seven photographer, a wonderful photographer who said to me one night, you never stop working, right? Because I won't even, I'll just say there was a love interest involved, and like getting to a bar was by 10 p.m. was something that somebody wanted to do. And I was like, 10 p.m., time for the night interviews. And and he said, you never stop working. And I said, oh, thank you. And he's like, I don't know where you thought that was a compliment, right? But I think you and I have that feeling when we are somewhere, we want it, like we are there to engage in what's at hand, right? So we are there to put ourselves into the experience as much as we possibly can. And that's one advantage of like not having to file every day or whatever. You can just live as much as you can in an experience for an extended period of time. And I know for us in Nigeria, that was important. I also know, which you may not recall, but from Iraq forward, I had the great privilege of watching you start to shoot digital, right? like chimping, remember that? Like the early days of like crouching, like making sure you got it, like crouching by the side of the road under a jacket. And you know, I was like, what is he doing? And you were obviously making sure that you had the shots, because it was like suddenly a huge privilege to be like, I don't have to wait to develop this. I can make sure I have it now.
Incredible. Anyway. But you know, the thing about the working, you're right. I mean, I love working with you because we are hard workers. In fact, usually when we've done a long assignment, both of us get sick, right? I mean, I always get sick afterwards. You know, I'm usually a few days where it's just, you know, I've rinsed myself out, and because as you say, you're there, and you know, there's no. I'm not there to sort of, it's not a holiday. It's not a holiday.
No, and we don't tend to see other journalists even if we're somewhere where we don't gather at night with people. We just we just do our work. And I remember, I remember, this is one of those things I'm sort of ambivalent about saying, because I hate when people take credit for this, but I was pregnant when we were in Afghanistan. And I remember one day going to lunch and talking to our translator, being like, we've got to go do, and then turning around and throwing up on the street and keeping talking.
I remember that.
Right?
I remember that.
And I just remember her face. But I also, like when we were in Afghanistan and I was pregnant, and I'll be honest, I thought that the women, knowing, like working with women, I assumed there'd be like oh, sister, you're so, like, thank you for coming to us pregnant. And instead, of course, there was like a feeling that pregnancy was like a curse, like, it's like the flu. You got struck with this thing. There was no thank you. It was the opposite. So I had to learn how to say I'm having a boy in Pashto, because that was the only thing.
And it might be worth it. Yeah.
Okay. Seamus, I'm seeing we want to keep the photos moving, because
so now we've reached, we've jumped across a lot of these. This is Lagos. This is driving again through the, I think it's on the bridge going into Lagos. But that poem, how long after, it's such an amazing poem, how long after that experience did you write that? I mean, how soon were you taking notes? Did you take notes? Was it something that came out of the blue, months, weeks later?
Probably months, weeks later. I don't typically write the poems. And we were talking about this before we started, and a little context for this, Seamus, and then will you keep leading us through, because this is the redonkulous traffic. This is a 4-hour traffic jam to do what? To get to church, because we talk about mega churches in America. We're talking about a couple thousand people. When Nigerians go to church, they do by the tens of thousands. And a lot of what we're seeing, a lot of this kind of crazy Christianity that grew up around Trump, and we won't get into this today, but the sort of like prosperity gospel, Paula White, all this stuff really comes from Nigeria. And it's this practice, and this is what you're seeing. You're seeing pastors preaching to tens of thousands of people coming up and dropping money at the pastor's feet for miracles. The pastor is seen as a prophet, like as a divine who can cast out demons, all of which, I will just say, is in Washington, D.C. We don't have to go to Nigeria to see it, but it did begin. A lot of it began in Nigeria and the global South.
This is the Muslim equivalent, not quite.
That's right. Because a lot of, weirdly, what happens is because the state is absent, right? The state is absent, and the border, and it's at best, it's rapacious, right? Like the state's out to get you, basically, in Nigeria and in many countries, obviously, in the global South. So people turn to religious identity to safeguard things like education, rights to a job, and I said electricity, like very basic things that we take for granted. Is like, okay, this is what I get as a citizen of Nigeria. Being a citizen of Nigeria means jack. Being a Christian or a Muslim is what's going to get you social services. And just one tiny step back in history, what we saw, the Young Men's Muslim Association in Egypt, which is a lot of what became the Muslim Brotherhood, like picking up trash, getting people medicine, was directly modeled on the Young Men's Christian Association, on missionaries coming to Egypt. So this isn't a new game. This dates back to the 1800s. But it is, how can religion and religious identity safeguard your existence? How is it linked to survival? And in Nigeria, there's competition over adherence. Like, how can we get these people into our fold and not the others? So this is one of those. This is a Muslim, like, I think they were out on Sunday because they wanted to show, right, that their holy day, like, we're here on Sunday, helping you too.
come to the end of the Nigerian slides. These are, again, these are these schools, these are the traditional things the kid would be doing. This is Christian version. This is Yalway and the whole story with this man. Do you want to get into that, or do you want to move on to Afghanistan? It's sort
I
of.
think we should. I think this is the man who was like, let's be honest. I've got 4 wives and 16 kids. Democracy works for me. We line up in a field, and we vote by Christian and Muslim, and Islam's always going to win. Which is just understanding democracy as a numbers game. Is really helpful, I think, in understanding like how democracy in other places doesn't work, how we assume that it does. So I think he's telling that story of and what happened in that field over an election was an incredibly violent massacre, where the Christians were the aggressors. And you see there that 55 victims are in this grave, and that was 55 Muslims, women, children, men, who the Christians had organized, surrounded a town, and deliberately massacred in order to show their power.
And this was just one grave of many. I mean, this was just one that, you know, and this was destruction during one of those sprees.
And again, all of this driven, not all of it, a lot of it driven by climate, because survival is contested here, because the spaces where people used to survive up north are no longer viable. They're desert. So Muslims are coming south. Nomadism, which is we'll give another talk on the death of nomadism. You can't really be a herder so successfully anymore because the grasslands aren't going to support your herd. So these are vehicles that were burned out in that raid. And what they refer to this in Nigeria is their 9/11, which predated ours. And again, it was Christians who were the aggressors. And that's one reason we wanted to make sure that we covered this, because what I think another thing, Seamus, that we love to do is complicate any kind of assumption that the Westerners have about how the world works. And it's like, no, here's in your face the opposite. You want to say that all Muslims are terrorists out there in the world? This is not what happened here. So I think that's just important to point out.
Right. Actually, that might be a good segue into Afghanistan and what we did there. Yeah. You know, I've been going there since '94. You've been going there for many years. We both, as you say, like to sort of be slightly iconoclastic. And we wanted to work in Afghanistan on some kind of project together, but we never really found something that we thought was fresh enough, broke new ground. And then we came across this book, Songs of Love and War by, I think Afghanistan's, could we say only or best modernist poet, Majrooh.
Majrooh, I think we would describe him as like a Scotch-loving groover. Like, I'm not even sure. I mean, he did write his own. Maybe we should say
Jack Kerouac of the Southern world.
Yes, why not?
Yeah,
why not? And hearkening back, obviously, to a time he ended up being killed, I think, by Hekmatyar's guys. So he was an early, like, he was how civil society used to function in a secular way, and then he was assassinated by, Islamic militants at in an earlier phase of modern life. Okay, so we came across this book, and you came across the book, Seamus. It's called Songs of Love and War in English, but in French and Pashto, it's called Songs of Love and Suicide. And what this groover had done during the 80s, Majrooh, he had traveled around in refugee camps in Pakistan of Afghans who had fled over the border. And I don't know how he pulled it off because he's a man. I think he was working with his sister, but that could be apocryphal. He collected these poems that are folk poems. They're 2 lines long. They have 22 syllables. They have to end in a sound ma or na, which is means nothing. It's a preposition. And they are called landes, and which is also the name for a sharp poisonous snake. That's Seamus. This is the cover of my newish book of poems, but can you tell us, this is the museum, isn't it?
Yeah, this is the National Museum in West Kabul, and it's a year after the Taliban lost Kabul. It wasn't the end of the Taliban as we know now, very much so. But I went back there a year later and was there November, December, just to see what had happened in the year since. And I walked into the National Gallery, and there were pieces like this of artifacts, faces. There was a picture of Jesus there, all torn up by the Taliban. And this was one of the guards. This was one of the people working there, and it's not something I normally do, but I asked her to do something with the picture, because the picture on its own, I took those pictures, they weren't that interesting, but I just thought with the woman's face, and you get that sense of discombobulation. And
it's so brilliant, though. I mean, this photograph is a poem, right? Because we are seeing, like, the Taliban, as many, literalist, fundamentalist groups, Christian, Muslim, what have you, don't believe, or one of the ideas, and then we found this to be bullshit because they were taking photos of themselves all the time, but they didn't believe in the images of people, right? That was haram, that was forbidden. And obviously, so what you see here, for when I look at this, I see the fracturing of hundreds of layers of society, right? Like what does I mean, not to be all wonky about it, but like, what does representation mean? Here you can take a picture of a woman. A woman can be a guard, which certainly was not the case, years before. And yet, what is left? It's not here, here's a sunny picture of a woman school teacher. It's putting together, like, here I am represented. Here's this fractured reality. It's so, you could look at this forever and find 100 million stories in it. I love this picture.
Paul, shall we play that film?
To be honest, Seamus, we're already, 45 minutes in, and the film, as you said, is going to take 12 minutes. I think. Yeah. I'd rather hear you talk. I think you can always share the link. Is it online anywhere?
I can make it available. Absolutely. Yeah. Good idea.
Yeah. So if you can do that while you're talking with Jenna, can share it.
Sure. So this is.
I think that would be better.
Okay. Fine. Good idea. This is, this project was to record and for Eliza to translate into English poetry, American poetry, these landes. And, there was a huge job that Eliza took on to find them, to source them, convince people to share them, because Eliza can give us the background to that. It's quite a very difficult thing. But I had the job of trying to photograph something to do with this. And I didn't want to just sort of illustrate the poems. I didn't even know what the poems were at that point, because they were actually in process of being translated or being found. So I would go off and find images I thought would work in some way. And what I liked about doing that was that rather than have a script, and if something is too literal and too slavish, it doesn't really add that much to the experience. But if it's sort of slightly off, as Eliza would say, slightly slant, then you're actually complementing it. You're adding to it. Like, two parts make more than two. And this was there's one underpass in Kabul, and it's a dark area, and there was a shop that had a laser that was sort of beaming out rays of light, colored light. And I just thought, God, wouldn't it be amazing if I caught a woman in a burqa walking through that? It would just be, many things. And eventually I got it. It took quite a while. There was a guy selling jewelry who kept coming up to me and trying to sell me jewelry. I didn't mind him doing that, but what I didn't want to have happen was when the moment came, I didn't want this guy in front of me smiling with jewelry. So I had to be quite rude to him, and it worked.
But it's classic Seamus. I'll just say, like, he spent days in this freezing middle of winter, dark underpass, like, getting this picture. He would go back and back the same way that, like, if you go with Seamus to Afghanistan before dawn, you will hear the knocking on tin of the rag pickers and tin sellers who are coming with their carts. You can guarantee that as soon as there's enough light in the sky for Seamus to start shooting these guys, like I would stir in bed, I'm like, here they come, dink, 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 and Seamus would be out on the street.
You know, they stopped their route because I was embarrassing them, apparently. You know, because I was walking after them, filming them and recording the sound. It sounds amazing. I love the sound of it. It's like a, you know, it's like a sort of opera of the Kabul streets. But it's something told me they've taken a different route, and I found the route, and it was like, yeah, it was like sort of stalking.
Of course you did. I mean, I can only imagine what people would make of that. So, okay, so a little context on these poems. So, okay, so Seamus found this book, Songs of Love and Suicide, and it had been collected in the 80s. And these landays are millennia old poems. They're folk poems. They take on 5 principal subjects: love, war, homeland, separation from your lover or from homeland, and then something called kham, which translates loosely to grief, which is the particular plight of a Afghan woman's life. So we were like, well, how are we want to go see how 3 decades, you know, have impacted these poems. They're passed mouth to mouth, ear to ear, and have been between Afghan women, Pashtun women for centuries. So I just started doing a lot of Googling for the Landay over time. And finally, what popped up was a tiny little squib in an Afghan paper, like an NGO paper, about a young woman who had died, who had killed herself, actually. She'd been a member of this Afghan women's literary society. And the one poem that survived her was one of these Landays. And her name, she was using a pseudonym, which we understood. Loving is not sin, right? I mean, that is so post-Taliban. That is so the nature of these poems, these Landay, because they talk a lot about love. They're pre-Islamic. They're back to a nomadic time of, you know, they take on landscape and love and all kinds of naughty things. And my favorite of the poems, it says, when sisters sit together, they're always praising their brothers. When sisters sit together, they're always praising their brothers. When brothers sit together, they're selling their sisters to others. So that's, I mean, they're subversive, and they can be subversive because they're anonymous. So Seamus and I went to Afghanistan to meet with this women's group. We never imagined we would be able to get too close to the death of this anonymous poet. The woman, it turned out she was from a place called Grishk in Lashkar. It was a super war zone, a super poppy infested Taliban area. And little by little, through the trust established by this women's organization, basically what they do is they meet openly in Kabul, but in Afghanistan's 34 provinces where it wasn't safe for them to meet, they would go be on local radio, and they had a poetry hotline. They had one mobile phone that they would answer, that would be often young girls calling in secret, and young girls who couldn't go to school for many reasons. And poetry had become their one outlet, and girls would call in and tell their stories and read their poems. And Zarmina was one of these young women. And through the trust established by this group and through our careful work, we were actually able to track down her family in Grishk, again, an extremely dicey situation. And we sat with the family, and the parents were like, no, that's not our daughter. Being a poet is associated with, because it's song and performance, is associated with prostitution in conservative families. So it's something that you would be killed for. And that's essentially what happened, that this young woman had called in week after week reading her poems. Her brothers had overheard her and misunderstood that she was calling a lover. And they had tried to kill her. She had survived. They had caught her again, and they were going to kill her. And what she did was set herself on fire, which is for her was a form of self-determination, and gets back to that songs of love and suicide, when a woman's choice, her only agency, is to take her own life. And she had called into the group for the last time from a hospital bed, telling them what she'd done. And that's how we were able to track her story down. And finally, so her parents disowned who she was. Um, Finally, her aunt and a couple of friends quietly affirmed, yes, this was our girl, this was our niece, our friend. And we were able to tell that story, and through telling that story, collect these poems, and then return to Afghanistan to collect more and make a book of them, um, which combines Seamus's photos over decades and about 100 of these folk poems, called I Am the Beggar of the World. And that title comes from one of the poems, which is, when I dream, I am the president. When I dream, I am the president. When I awake, I am the beggar of the world. Seamus, what else about that experience? I mean, these are photos that have such profound depth of experience, right, to them. What else do you want to add about those poems that I didn't? I mean, you made a film of them, which I think you might be able to make available to people, or?
Yeah, sure, absolutely, I'll make it available. I just found that they were the truest thing I ever came across in Afghanistan. I think we both did. It was the real truth of people's lives, and as you say, they were anonymous. They are anonymous, and so they don't have to worry about being caught out. Love the fact that that they now are being shared on Facebook, and this is the way they transmit,
Yeah.
not just at weddings. And in fact, when I made that film, it ended up being just the voices of the women in Pashto and the translation into English. At one stage, I was going to make a whole much bigger film with the process that you went through of finding people, the Facebook meetings. You were there with a translator going through all that stuff. But I ended up stripping it right back and just having just their voices alone. But it's remarkable. I think they're remarkable, and they're funny and they're bawdy, and
That's exactly, and where I think this brings what Seamus and I wanted to do, what these poems allowed us to do, was we are not A1, like, we are not on the news cycle, like, so many stories. Here's what this did for me. So I would walk around Kabul and I would think that I understood the nature of the woman wearing a burqa, how she was subjugated, that she was much more likely to be hit by a car because she didn't have her peripheral vision under the burqa, that I understood the terms of her life better than she did. And that is just such bullshit, right? And what these poems did was explode any kind of facile notion of an Afghan woman as a mute blue ghost beneath a burqa. And it was a way to look out through Afghan eyes at the quietness and screwed upness and humor and subjugation and sex, and power implicit in women's lives and women's ways of looking, without doing more than translating what women themselves were saying. And they didn't want to share that. There's, much has been said and written about Pashtunwali, which is the code of like closed Pashtun society. Some of it's true and some of it's convenient. But there is an idea of sharing culture with an outsider that is dicey. And part of the process of collecting these was really getting the women to share them. And that was not so easy. Do you remember this guy, this Malik Seamus?
Yes, he was part of the Wadan, the NGO's Malik program, where it's a very, very interesting way of trying to, influence human rights in society. It's that, you use what's already there. You use the structure that's already there. There is a democracy there. It's their democracy. And so if you can influence the Maliks, who are all, I mean, from what I can gather, very reasonable people, very wise people, some of them, if you can influence them and make it obvious to them that, it's better to behave this way. It's more civilized in a general sense, in that it's better for everyone, better for society. You know, that this man was part of this, and he was apparently a very enthusiastic member of this group. And they would meet the NGO, and they would come from their villages, which are often behind Taliban lines. This guy was in a pretty extreme place, and on the way back, apparently from one of these meetings, the Taliban stopped him and killed him. That's what I know about him. So,
I mean, what I'll add, and then let's take some questions.
Sure.
What I'll add is that, you know, these Maliks are the local government. So it's like if somebody gets into fight over like land or whatever, you go to a jirga and they will help make decisions in a very practical way. And again, there's so many systems in Afghanistan that predate the arrival of this kind of retrograde religious ideology. And part of what we celebrated in the poems is that. Okay, so let's open to some questions.
Sure.
Paul, do you want to?
If anybody else has any more questions, please do type them into the Q&A box. So we've got one question from Kuno, who's sort of really interested, I think, in how to weave what you might call a socio-political analysis of a situation of these very complex societies that you're trying to understand into the aesthetic. And within that, sort of thinking through how do you and Seamus work together on thinking through that. And obviously as a writer, obviously you've got to try and get a lot of that sort of an analytical context, but then also you want to write something that has a formal quality that's readable and that's kind of, you know, engaging the reader. So I'm just interested for both of you really, how do you try to navigate that space between content and form, if you like, in terms of trying to produce work that is both, you know, deeply resonant of the situation, but also, you know, engaging and grabs the reader's attention or grabs the audience's attention?
I think this, you know, visually, and also the narrative, the stories that you come across in Afghanistan are so extraordinary. You don't really have to ramp things up. You don't have. I mean, basically, if you can observe, and if you can, I mean, that was what's so wonderful about the Landais, because they were from the people's mouths themselves, and you know, unvarnished, and incredibly imaginative and funny. And I think that's what you do. You go to a place to learn about it, you know, the culture, learn from the people. You don't go there to impose a style on them. You go there and you honestly capture and record, you know, what it is they're saying and they'll tell you, you know, they want. This is the thing that I always find that people say, like, you know, should you be going to these places? Well, these people, they do, you know, they're not hiding themselves away. They want to talk. They want to, you know, say what it is about life that pisses them off or makes them happy. And I think if you honor that, it's fairly straightforward. You know, there's no gimmicks to it. And you do it in the most professional way, and as you say, in the most engaging way, because you want people to listen to it, you want people to read it, and you want people to watch it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we work pretty intuitively through what comes at us. I'm not interested, I don't take a lot of time to get contextual information while we're in the field. I can do all that after. I want to make sure that we've got what I would call foreground narrative. And I'm going to step back for a minute to say, Seamus has taught me some of the most important lessons in my life as a journalist. On a practical level, on a page level, what he does is ask me pretty early on, who are the characters here? What's going on in the story? Like what kind of scenes are you seeing? And what that has helped me do is be extremely deliberate and aware. If I think that I'm in something, in a scene, I'm going to work harder to make sure that I have all the details. It's helped me establish narrative through lines earlier because it's helpful for us to work through them, like what's happening. But I do want to share just a moment. Early on, you know, when we were in Iraq, that was really my first experience in a war zone in 2003. And it was a real one, as usual, with Seamus and another small group of journalists who were not Americans. We had gotten out in front. We are so far from embedded, like we're the opposite, right? We'd gotten in front of the American front line. We were in the middle of shelling between Iraqi forces and the Americans. We rocked up on some American special forces who were so pissed off to see us there. But when Kirkuk fell, we were in there before the Americans. We were in there with the Kurds who took the city. And so I just wanted to, and what happened is we were sitting, I know this is a diversion, but I think it's really worth it. Seamus taught me, we were watching the city fall. I was trying to work out, what do I do as a journalist? And one of Saddam's forces, a Fedayeen loyalist, was rounded up by the Kurds. And we watched him rounded up and put into a quote unquote ambulance. And I was like, okay, Seamus, let's go. What else is happening? And he's like, no, this is when it matters that we are here, because they are going to kill him if we leave. So what, like with all this like bearing witness and what does our presence matter and all of that, what really mattered there is that we were physically there watching, and it saved a man's life. And I can, Seamus, do you think I should read the poem or should we go? I'm really aware that there are lots of people who want to ask questions. Maybe skip.
There are not a huge number of questions. So if you did want to read a poem, I think we've got just enough time for that.
Okay, all right. So this is the first poem I wrote for Seamus, and the title comes from the Bible, Come and See, but it also comes from this crazy film that is one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen, which also reminds me of something Seamus would make. If Seamus gets a body cam, I'm not going on a body cam trip, but okay, so here we go. Come and See. You said it, Seamus, marching down the grizzled ridge, while the boy collected Dashka shells in a helmet he held by the chin strap, like Easter. Everywhere was mined, and so much mud. Downtown, a Syrian sat on the curb. His captors stood by, watched us, waited for us to leave. You knew what that first black hood meant, hailed a makeshift ambulance. The man was lifted from the curb alive, at least until the white door shut.
Very powerful.
So we have got a question about sort of, I suppose, it's not really a question, but it's kind of a request that Seven might do some workshops with writers and photographers about developing projects. But that leads to a question of how much are you able to kind of create a long-term partnership like that and plan and suggest and pitch projects to potential outlets or clients? You know, is that possible within a kind of writing partnership, or are you too much dictated to by the vagaries of magazine editors and photo editors versus text editors and so on and so forth? I mean, how much have you been able to say, we'd like to work together on this story and then find a way to do that?
We seem to manage it. There are some outfits that, you know, because the structure, the editorial team of one, whether it's words or pictures, are very strong, and, you know, understandably they want us to maintain their autonomy. They will choose our writer, we'll choose our photographer. But I think it's possible. It just depends on the publication. I don't know about things now. I haven't done stuff for magazines for a while. It's a different world.
No, I mean, sort of the funny, and this is so us, that poetry project was in the cutting edge news publication of Poetry Magazine, right? The oldest poetry magazine in America gave us a full issue, which I'm not sure they've ever done before.
No, apparently not. It was the first time in 112-year history.
Yeah. So
that's an accolade.
I would say Seamus and I, it's part of our kind of scrappy nature that we are not company men and women. So we are, which I hope none of my employers are watching, but like, we're gonna do the project, right? So if somebody's gonna say, no, you can't do it, we're gonna say, thank you very much, and go find somebody who will let us do it. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yeah. I think you find that with, you know, writers and photographers, you know, that have a connection, they generally will sort of, you know, say, okay, well, if you won't do this, we'll go elsewhere. Yeah.
But I think probably I would say, like I think of you and Anthony Lloyd, right? I have a feeling that American publications are the worst, right?
Yes.
They're the most controlling. So I would say if you want to try this, stay into UK. American publications
Yeah.
are most hands-on.
It's a sort of difficult question, of course, to answer, but having been in some pretty difficult situations that potentially were a threat to your own personal safety, what makes you go back again? I mean, having experienced something like some of the stories you told us today, what makes you feel like you need to go back again, or you want to go back again to, whether it's a particular country or just back to this kind of situation where things are potentially difficult to report on?
Well, you're never expecting it to happen again. In fact, you're never expecting it to happen in the first place. So when it happens again, you feel a bit pissed off. And I guess you're interested enough in whatever you're doing. I mean, do you remember that time when we went to Gereshk and we were in the governor's compound, and it was all very top secret, and you were wearing burqas, and Asma was wearing a burqa, and we did this whole thing, got up really early, to leave, no fanfare. And as we drove out, this guy in a rickshaw came and drove into us. And I actually thought it was a suicide rickshaw, because I could see it was happening. The guy wasn't looking. And then a crowd came around us, and you took off your burqa. I started taking photographs. It was a clown show, and we thought, well, that's the end of that. But then we decided we'd go on. Had something happened to us, the world would have said, what a bunch of fools.
Yeah, they would have.
They would. It's like I heard this when Marie Colvin died. People were saying, well, she did it too often. Yeah, but they weren't saying that when she was getting these scoops and doing extraordinary stories and, writing about the plight of Syrians, when she was publishing it. But, when it happened, suddenly everyone else was right.
That's right. And that happened to me, in Waziristan. I had a similar experience of that as well. But what I just want to say about the suicide rickshaw moment. Okay, so picture this. We are in like a complete militarized zone. We've just left the office of the Minister of Women's Affairs, who herself is her arms in a sling because she survived like 3 suicide bomber attempts in the past week, right? We're going into Taliban country, and we have because you have to make a decision. Do you want like the big protection as you go in, which is going to make you obviously a target, or do you want little scrappy dudes who might not be able to do much? And we went for scrappy dudes. And Seamus is so funny. You are the funniest person I know. And so we are in this like couldn't be more tense, like are we about to be killed situation. And we're starting down a road, and some Dummkopf in basically like a souped up bicycle contraption smashes into our convoy. And Seamus says in English, suicide rickshaw. And I've never seen Afghans laugh harder, right? Because it was just like, that is the dark humor of life. And Seamus and I are the kind of journalists who are much more interested in the suicide rickshaw than the suicide bomber, right? Because that's life.
And also we were taking the risk, whatever. It wasn't for some huge story. I mean, it was to us, it was a huge story. It was to try and see the grave of Zarmina. It was the poetry story. That's what we were after.
Yeah, we sometimes joke about that project and call it investigative poetry. The risk is secondary. And again, it is not about us. So if the story is going to involve a risk, you assess that risk in terms of doing it. But it's not about getting close to risk. We like liminal places. We like places where people are making meaning of their lives in very visceral ways. And those tend to have danger associated with them. But the thing, of course, to remember is that the danger, we may face it for an hour, and the people who live it face it every hour, every day. So it's not about the risk, it's about being careful. This is right before us is an extraordinarily talented Lima Niazi, young Afghan poet.
And this is the Mirman Bahir group.
She is a part of that group. We have here on the right, this is Sahira Sharif, who was an Afghan parliamentarian, and she started this group, which, yes, it's about literature. It's about women coming together and writing poems, but really it's about creating community and creating networks that then are survival networks, are putting women into professional places. Oh, that's one. Here's what the hoodly do is on my head. Some kind of, I still have that code. So this is translating Allende. This is how we rocked
In
it.
the car, yeah, in the
In
car.
a car.
I should, yes, here's Asma.
Here's our lovely, incredible, reluctant translator, who Asma Safi, who ended up, she died. She had a heart issue. She died in a taxi. We weren't with her on her way. Okay, I'm going to read that poem, and then that's on her way to the hospital in Kabul. Let me see if I can find that poem. I hadn't thought of reading that, but I feel like we should. We dedicated the project to her. Okay, here's the poem for Asma. And it's got a little epigraph to it, which just says, for Asma Safi, 1985 to 2013, who worked as a translator in Afghanistan, suffered from a congenital heart condition and died in a taxi on her way to the hospital in Kabul. Before she died, she asked her father to bury her body in the family village in Kunar province, which was held by the Taliban. Her father feared that her funeral might draw the unwanted attention of an American drone operator who would mistake Asma's burial for a Taliban gathering. Despite his fears, and although the Taliban did attend the funeral to pay respects, there was no drone strike. So here's the poem for Asma, and that's what it's called, Asma. Again, we think of your father shouldering your shrouded body in a taxi toward the war. You'd ask to be buried in your grandfather's village, ground so rife with disaster that 2 or 3 gathered could draw the reaper's eye. Your father knew a daughter can be martyred, sure as any son. Your life was forfeit to a country come undone.
Wonderful. And this is her on the phone, playing the. This is the woman that we met, that you met in the hospital grounds. This is live translation.
So maybe just a final question. Do you have a project together you're working on now? Or if not, what are you both working on at the moment? It's always difficult to say sometimes what your future plans are, but where are you both? Do you have anything together planned, or are you working on individual projects now?
Possibly. We talked about this. There's a project I've been doing in Afghanistan since 1994. It's a family that I know, and various things have happened in their lives. And I've been, whenever I've been there, I've photographed it, and I've talked to Eliza about possibly interviewing the woman of the household. So that might be something which we'll work on.
We're both in different ways exploring America, which is, we didn't get to that work today. We spent some time in Appalachia together, looking at extractive industry, right? Like why is it that people who are some of the poorest in the world live on land richest in natural resources, which is not just a Nigerian phenomenon, but an American and global one as well. So
we'll have to bring you back at some point to talk about America then, I think.
That sounds great.
Well, thank you very much, both of you. Some great comments, beautiful work. And I think we'll leave it on that dark humor of life, which I think really sums up the work you've been doing together, and beautiful writing and beautiful photography, obviously, but also very profound and very insightful. So thank you again for a wonderful conversation between you. I think I've really enjoyed it. I'm sure the audience have too. A big round of online virtual applause to both of you. And obviously the great news is that 7 Insider is now free. We've managed to find sponsorship to fund it for free. So please do join all of our future talks and all of our future sessions. Really enjoyed today's session with them, and we'll see you back shortly, I hope, in our next ones. Thank you very much. And a big thank you to Gianna behind the scenes for organizing all of this, and a big thank you obviously to Seamus and Eliza for such a fascinating conversation between you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Gianna.